Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I'm really excited to bring you today's video. If you enjoy my content, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. Let's get started. The year 2003 was no ordinary year for Eric LeMarque. He was an avid enthusiast of skiing, and a winter holiday in the mountains of Utah seemed like the perfect opportunity to deepen his love for the sport. However, he had no idea that a tragic event was waiting for him. LeMarque knew the area he had chosen for skiing very well. It was a remote location surrounded by mountains, popular among skiers and nature lovers. He preferred to spend time there, alone, loving the challenge of skiing in the harsh conditions of the snowy wilderness. The weather was initially calm, the temperature was typical for winter, and snowflakes gently descended from the mountain peaks. The day seemed perfect, as if everything was in place. However, nature's course is always unpredictable, and LeMarque would soon witness this firsthand. Around noon, the weather conditions began to change. From afar, dark clouds swiftly approached the mountains, and by the time Eric realized the scale of the change, it was too late. At that moment, Eric was fully focused on the freedom and adrenaline rush he felt while skiing. He noticed the weather was changing, but as an experienced skier in the mountains, he didn't pay much attention to the warning signs. The wind grew stronger and the snow intensified, quickly reducing visibility to almost nothing. As the cold, frozen air surrounded him, Eric realized that a blizzard was approaching. By the time he understood the severity of the storm, there was little he could do. Around him, there were vast snow-covered areas and deep valleys. Many of the landmarks he relied on for direction had disappeared, and he found himself without any way to guide himself. The storm continued to intensify, and everything quickly spiraled out of control. At that moment, Eric had drifted far from the area where he had been skiing and into the deep, steep valleys of the mountains. Within minutes, the environment had changed so drastically that it felt as though he had fallen into another world. Lost and alone in the vast, snow-covered wilderness, Eric realized that his skills and years spent in the mountains might not be enough to save him. For many skiers, getting lost in the mountains could be one of the most terrifying experiences of their lives, and Eric began to feel a similar fear, but he didn't panic. The cold, sharpened by the wind, quickly enveloped his body. The cold was freezing the areas around his eyes and numbing the sensitivity in his hands. His only option was to stay calm and assess the situation as accurately as possible. But another problem arose. Being in the middle of a snowstorm, the chances of getting help from outside were slim. As the temperature continued to drop and the effects of the snowstorm intensified, a feeling of panic began to stir within him. He had lost the area where he had been skiing and ended up on a different part of the mountain. The storm grew so intense that it was impossible for Eric to find his bearings or follow any traces. In those moments, the fear and hopelessness of being alone began to grow in Eric's mind. But at the same time, the survival instincts that every skier knows so well began to take over. He had to focus mentally. He reminded himself to stay as calm as possible and decided to look for an escape route from where he had become lost. But every direction he tried only seemed to isolate him further. Indeed, this was going to be a test for Eric. Amid the brutal storm, he continued moving for several hours. But with each step, the snow grew deeper, and the visual barriers around the mountains made his efforts seem in vain. Slowly, the blizzard began to trap him more and more. Realizing that he was lost and had reached a point where he was completely alone, Eric had no choice but to prepare for the difficult struggle ahead. The only thing he could do in that moment was remind himself that it wasn't over yet and continue fighting for his survival. Eric LeMarque had always felt deeply connected to the tranquility and freedom that skiing in the mountains and snow provided. But that day, there was no sign that everything would take a drastic turn. He was an experienced skier who had always overcome the challenges of nature while skiing. But that day, a moment of inattention and the unpredictable change in nature's face would thrust Eric into a battle for survival. The storm had started with a light breeze but gradually turned into an unstoppable force. The snow continued to fall, increasing in intensity. The wind grew stronger the further Eric went. He had found peace for a moment while skiing, but he quickly realized that this peace wouldn't last. Visibility was shrinking, and with the growing intensity of the storm, everything around him disappeared. Trying to stay mentally calm, Eric couldn't find any familiar landmarks around him. Normally, he would pay attention to noticeable trails, tracks and markers in the area where he skied. But now everything was covered in snow and everything blended together. The snow seemed to cover the earth evenly, as if it were meant to blanket the entire landscape. Every direction looked the same. After a while, Eric realized, to his surprise, that he had gotten lost. He felt alone and lost. The storm had become so severe that it was impossible even to hear his own voice. At first, it was just the feeling of being lost. But as time passed, this sense of being lost began to turn into a disaster. As the temperature dropped, his body slowly started to freeze. The cold from the storm was making each step more difficult for Eric. At some point, the storm wasn't just attacking him from the outside, it was also attacking him from within. He was beginning to slip into the dark corners of his own mind. What Eric initially didn't realize was that it was much more than just the feeling of being lost. In the conditions of a lost skier, it soon became clear that he had to face the harsh reality of fighting for survival. He had lost his way, and in many ways, this loss of direction marked the beginning of facing death. At that moment, alone, in the mountains, he had no choice but to look for a way out. The storm had completely consumed Eric. With visibility reduced to zero, he couldn't find any traces or directional indicators. Despite having skied for many years, the loneliness he was feeling now was of a type he had never encountered before. There was a place in the midst of the vast, isolated, empty area around him where he didn't belong. The massive mountains. Around him, the hiking trails that had once reassured him now held no meaning. Everything was white and silent. Under the storm's influence, Eric's physical and mental limits were being tested. He felt even more lost with every passing moment. As he moved forward, he couldn't find a single track around him. With every step, it felt as though he was sinking deeper, but he was only getting more lost. He truly was lost in the mountains. The whiteness everywhere, combined with the snow and wind, made it impossible to find any direction. All that remained was the sound of the snowstorm and the howling of the wind. He had found himself surrounded by snow, the very thing that had become his greatest enemy. Eric had nothing in his hands that could help him survive. He hadn't brought a GPS device, a radio, or any device capable of receiving cell phone signals while skiing. He was truly alone. No one was around, and he had to rely on his inner strength to survive. As the hours passed, his survival instincts kicked in. While feelings of hopelessness and fear grew in Eric's mind, the instinct to survive grew stronger. An inner voice was telling him to keep going. Amid the silence and the noise of the snowstorm, he could feel his heart racing. But at the same time, he was physically starting to wear out. His body trembled from the cold and exhaustion. He had to find a way to protect himself. Eric was getting more lost with each passing minute. He began to think about the things he needed to do to survive. Building shelter, staying warm, searching for food. But all of it felt like a waste of time. Right now, as a lost man, there was nothing he could do except keep moving. This was a battle for survival in the snowstorm, a fight to stay alive, alone in nature. Although he felt alone, Eric's determination to survive was pushing him to keep going. This journey would test not only his physical, but also his mental strength. As he continued deeper into the mountains, Eric had no idea what his next step would be. But one thing was certain. To survive this snowstorm, he would have to give everything he had. After being lost for the first few days, Eric fully understood how tough and exhausting the fight for survival would be. The storm hadn't stopped, and the snow was becoming denser the further he went. With every step, the snow grew deeper and everything began to look the same. But at that moment, survival was his biggest goal. Indeed, these first days would be a process where Eric would push both his body and mind to their limits. At first, his body was somehow adapting to survive. But as the intensity of the snowstorm increased, the cold became increasingly unbearable. Although his ski clothes had protected him for a while, they were slowly becoming ineffective due to the storm. The cold began to seep deeply into his body. Every muscle, every joint, every movement became painful. His hands and fingers were numb, and his feet were almost losing all feeling. Each step in the snow became harder and consumed more energy. The intensity of the snow combined with the cold was wearing Eric down. The first few hours were spent with basic survival instincts kicking in. The subconscious knowledge of what needed to be done to survive was rapidly activated. First, he decided to find shelter to prevent his body temperature from dropping. While lost and alone in the snow, he needed to do something simple: protect himself. He tried building shelters by creating snow walls to shield himself from the cold. As the depth of the snow increased, building a shelter became more difficult, but he continued to try different methods to find a more protected spot beneath the snow. Since he had gotten lost, Eric's body had started to cool down slowly. With his rapidly depleting energy, every movement became more difficult. Not being able to find food became a larger problem over time. Simply moving from one place to another in the snow was draining his energy further. By the end of the first days, his body was severely exhausted. Every step under the snow felt like a heavy burden. In his mind, there was only one thought: to survive. The inability to find food was another challenging factor for Eric. His body was rapidly losing strength due to the lack of energy. Almost all the food in his bag had been consumed, and only a few snacks remained. These snacks were not enough for him to survive for long. His thoughts were consumed by one question: what can I do to survive? But searching for food in the deep snow was incredibly challenging. The more energy he spent trying to find food, the more exhausted his body became. As the cold seeped into every corner of Eric's body, his mind began to crumble as well. Despair and fear started to envelop him more with every passing hour. But Eric was trying to constantly motivate himself to break free from the mental collapse. Pushing away the pessimistic thoughts in his mind became one of his greatest battles for survival. At every moment, he faced the risk of losing himself. Yet somehow he continued to resist every thought that came to him. I can get out of this. I must believe in myself. I can survive. He tried to find inner strength. The cold, pain, and exhaustion were constantly trying to stop him from surviving. But somehow, in every moment, he found the strength to continue fighting against the snowstorm. His survival instinct and determination were keeping him upright against these deadly conditions. The snowstorm outside was challenging not only Eric's body, but also his mental health. But he remained focused on survival. At night, the storm made the cold even worse. After long hours of sleeplessness, sleeping had become nearly impossible. Eric, with his exhausted body, forced his eyes to stay open, waiting with hope for something to change. Every second passed in the dark and cold, and with each passing moment, his body weakened further. However, by gathering his thoughts, he continued to see each minute as an opportunity to survive. In the early days, everything seemed tough and hopeless for Eric. But he was trying to find a solution without falling into despair, remaining alone in the snowstorm. The snow, cold, hunger, and exhaustion continued to push him, but they did not allow him to mentally collapse. His determination, endurance, and survival instinct were the strongest factors that kept him alive. This was the beginning of Eric's fight for survival, and every ounce of hope in his mind would push him one step further. As Eric LeMarque entered the third day of his survival struggle, he began to feel that his body was becoming more and more exhausted with each passing day. The intensity of the snowstorm and the cold were becoming increasingly unbearable with each passing hour. His body was slowly losing energy, and fatigue and hunger had overwhelmed him. However, this was just the beginning of the physical challenges. Eric's real battle began with the serious problem in his foot. At first, he only felt a slight pain in his foot. But as time passed, this pain, combined with the cold, became unbearable. By the end of the third day, the frostbite on his right foot had become very noticeable. The cold was rapidly spreading throughout his body, but the pain in his foot made Eric realize exactly what he was up against. His big toe and other toes were starting to turn purple, and the cold had affected the tissues, blocking the blood flow. When Eric stopped for a moment to inspect his foot, he realized the severity of the situation. The skin on his foot had turned pale and gray, and he had lost all feeling in it. With every step, he could barely feel it. At first, he thought this was just a temporary effect of the cold, but as the pain and numbness continued to worsen, he understood that his foot was seriously damaged. The blood circulation in his foot had slowed down, the blood vessels were blocked, and the tissues had started to die. This was one of the most dangerous situations Eric had faced in his struggle to survive in the mountains. At first, he began looking for a solution. The frostbite in his foot seemed like it would quickly spread to the other parts of his body. With his survival instincts kicking in, he realized he had to act fast. He tried to find someone who could help him save his foot, but there was no one around. The cold and the snowstorm made the mountains feel like a silent graveyard. There was no one but himself, only cold and snow. Eric began searching for other solutions to save his foot. First, he decided to spend more time in his shelter to evaluate the situation. He had built a shelter in the snow to keep himself warm, but it only temporarily blocked the cold. It was not enough to slow the frostbite process in his foot. As he felt his foot continuing to freeze, he realized that wasting more time would only reduce his chances of survival. Determined to protect his foot, Eric knew that simply keeping his body warm wouldn't be enough. The restriction of blood flow, the deepening frostbite, and the tissue death posed a serious risk. Every part of his body seemed to be a threat, but he knew that in order to stand and move, he had to solve this problem. Before mentally collapsing, Eric tried to find a solution for the frostbite in his foot, sometimes relying on his instincts, sometimes trying to think logically. He kept moving forward. He thought that the only thing he could do to stop the frostbite was to try and keep his foot as warm as possible. But as he sank deeper into the snow, even moving his foot was becoming more and more difficult. His toes were numb. However, he had to do everything he could to improve the situation. After a while, Eric realized that there was no other option left. The only solution to save his foot was to take a more radical step and protect himself from these harsh survival conditions. The cold and hunger had forced him to make a survival decision. As he was lost in the freezing snowstorm, he felt everything would get worse. The frostbite on his foot had advanced so much that some areas of his body were now changing color, and his toes had become completely numb. In that moment, he thought about what the only solution to hold on to life was. He realized that the only thing that could keep him alive was solving this issue. At this point, he had to act quickly before losing any more of his body. However, this decision would break him both physically and emotionally. Sometimes, in order to survive, you have to take the scariest steps. As a last resort to save his foot, Eric decided to resolve the situation in his own way. Every passing minute created a bigger risk, but his survival instinct was the only guide that would show him the way through the snowstorm. Eric LeMarque would have to make the most terrifying, painful, and radical decision of his life to survive. The cold, hunger, loneliness, and exhaustion were becoming unbearable with each passing day, and the situation with his foot had become even more serious. By the end of the third day, the frostbite had progressed even further. The infection and gangrene in his foot had reached a level that could lead to the death of his tissues. The harshness of the weather, the intensity of the snowstorm, and the hopelessness of being completely alone had brought Eric to the most critical point of his survival struggle. The frostbite on his foot and the blocked blood flow made it clear to him that he had to find a solution in order to survive. The rapid infection and bleeding in his foot were pushing him further away with each passing day. It was something he had to act on for the sake of survival. If left untreated, the infection would spread quickly through his body and lead to fatal consequences. Eric realized that only one solution remained in the face of this threat: to amputate his foot. However, the challenges of this radical solution were enormous. Eric was alone in the mountains and had not brought any medical supplies with him. The only tools he had to perform a surgical procedure were the ski poles he had fashioned into a knife and the rocks he could find around him. With these tools, he had to perform an operation that would be extremely painful and whose success was uncertain. As Eric tried to gather his thoughts, he carefully examined his foot. The bruising and the darkened skin reminded him painfully of the truth. If he lost his foot, his chances of survival would be almost zero. Therefore, Amputating his foot was the only option left for him to continue moving forward healthily. Into his mind, he was torn between painful thoughts and his survival instincts. Amputating his foot would be a horrific blow not only to his body but also to his mind. However, Eric had to push aside his thoughts and, taking a deep breath, get to work. His only goal was to survive somehow in these merciless winter conditions. To succeed, he would have to try every possible solution. First, he took the ski pole and focused on the fleshy areas of his foot. Holding the rocks, he struggled to make a clean cut. But the hardest part was the sharpness of the ski pole and the inadequacy of the rocks. Every cut brought immense pain. Each movement caused excruciating sensations, and this horrific process went on for hours. In the freezing snow, every movement felt like fire within his body. But no matter how painful it was, he had no choice but to push forward. Despite the hours of agony, Eric was determined to finish the task. His body was nearly exhausted, his energy depleted, but the thing that kept him going was his desire to find a solution with every step and his relentless will to survive. With every passing minute, the pain intensified, his hands trembled, yet he pressed on, giving everything he had to amputate his foot. The pain surrounded his body, but mentally, he was resolute. With each stroke, he fought a little harder to survive and felt a little stronger. When he began to amputate his foot, he found himself on the edge of a survival battle. His vision blurred, his hands trembled, but at that moment he knew this painful decision would save his life. After hours of courage and willpower, Eric finally amputated his foot. Each cut, each second, brought him face to face with death. But in the end, he succeeded. However, this procedure was not only a physical decision, it was also a mental and emotional journey. By losing a part of his body, Eric further isolated himself. But he had to do what he needed to survive. Losing his foot was only the beginning for him. By taking this brave step, he had gained another chance to survive alone in the mountains in the heart of the storm. After amputating his foot, his body, filled with pain, slowly began to heal. This radical decision had given him something more important than anything: hope for survival. Now, there was a chance to survive. Only his mental strength and survival instinct were guiding him. But one thing was certain: this painful journey would make him stronger and more determined. Eric LeMarque, after pushing the limits of human survival, courage, and determination, had finally found his salvation. After amputating his foot and fighting the great battle to survive, the doors to the rescue he had been waiting for began to open after 8 days of pain and exhaustion. But this was just the beginning, as the experience he had lived through would deeply affect him both mentally and physically, and change his life forever. At first, everything felt like a nightmare for Eric. His body was exhausted, and his energy had run out. The wound in his foot and the cold had further worn him down. Yet somehow, with each passing minute, he managed to find a glimmer of hope for life. Throughout this ordeal, each passing hour had changed something in Eric's mind. His determination to survive pushed him one step further each time. His body had become extremely weak, yet it had become a symbol of the battle he fought to stay alive. Despite everything, Eric was still alive. After the 4th day, he relentlessly searched within himself for the strength to not lose hope. Cold, hunger, and pain almost broke him multiple times, but Eric's will to survive kept him alive. Though mentally broken, his body continued to exist. The only thing keeping him alive was his search for an opportunity to survive in these harsh winter conditions. He was fighting not only physically but mentally as well. Eventually, he seized the chance to escape this deadly and brutal environment. At the end of the 8th day, a search team finally found Eric. While conducting a search in the area where Eric had gone missing, despite the harsh conditions and intense snowstorm, the team members managed to find traces of Eric. When they saw Eric, who had survived against all odds, they were astounded to realize he was still alive. He was completely exhausted but still had a glimmer of hope to live. The team immediately took him to the hospital safely. Upon arrival at the hospital, his body was severely dehydrated, weakened due to malnutrition, and traumatized by the prolonged cold and pain. He went through several treatment processes, but somehow he managed to survive. The trauma Eric experienced was not just physical, it was also a mental one. His mind and body were so worn out that the process profoundly affected him and transformed his entire life. However, Eric's determination to survive had given him a new perspective on life. This horrific experience could have turned him into both a symbol of survival and a different kind of human being. After this event, Eric LeMarque dedicated his life to a new purpose. The challenges and fight for survival had given him not just physical strength but also mental power. This experience had made him stronger and more resilient. The trauma had caused him to internalize his survival determination and courage. After this, he realized that survival is not just a physical struggle, but also a mental battle. His body had resisted all kinds of hardship, but the real fight had been on the mental level. Eric decided to write a book after this extraordinary experience. In his book, he explained that the fight for survival is not only about external challenges, but also about inner strength and determination. He wanted to share his story with the world because the pain he endured had not only strengthened him, but also taught everyone a lesson that even in the darkest moments of life, one should never lose hope. In his book, he deeply explored the importance of searching for a light, even amidst pain and despair. Eric LeMarque's story didn't just convey how valuable survival is. It also showed the importance of discovering the hidden strength within oneself in the most challenging circumstances. His struggle was not only a physical victory but also a mental one. Despite losing his foot, his belief and determination to survive gave him the chance to reclaim his life. Eric's story gave the message that one must never lose hope even in the darkest times. Eric LeMarque not only shared a survival story with the world, but also demonstrated an example of a person's true strength and what one can do to stay alive. He became a symbol beyond all the challenges he faced, a symbol of the power and courage to survive. His story proved that anyone could find the strength within themselves and stand tall, even in the toughest moments.